Previously on Moya, the male had a fracture to his skull, but I don't think it would have been nearly damaging enough to have killed him. Both the young man and the girl were fit as a fiddle before they died. Most knew their parents to some degree, even if it was just talk. They were reassigned a few years back now, moved out of the system, I'm afraid. Using my thumb and forefinger, I parted the stiff upper lip from the lower, exposing the vivid purple flesh on the inside of the man's lips. There was a small symbol, tattooed in a bluing ink that blended with the cold skin. As the snow fell, I looked down onto the doorstep where a young man was lying motionless, his naked body sprawled on the ground. Sergeant Ashbridge looked down at the body laying on the floor, then up at me sitting on the bed, and raised his eyebrows silently. "Each of us all, Sergeant." "Each of us all, James? What on earth is all this?" "Your guess is as good as mine." I filled the sergeant in on the details of my findings from the day before, the symbol on the young ministry man's lip, my trip to the diner, and my plans to visit Professor Maybury to ask about religious groups in the area. Mark Briar. The first victim. His fiancée was Tracy Shielding. You best start taking notes on people's names if you're to start asking questions around the residential district. People are not so anonymous in the outer districts. And what about him? I nodded towards the body still laying on the doorstep of my motel cabin, the snow slowly collecting around the crevices in his collapsed state. Robbie Milton. His parents both work up at the local ministry office. They deal with mainly housing, industry and workforce development affairs. Quite well known and not particularly well liked in the area, as you can imagine. They're good people, but they take the brunt of the backlash against reassignment refusals for the most part. They're the visible face of the ministry out here, you see. Wouldn't that mean that they live on the other side of the residential district? That they do, James. They live not far from me, up with all the other office and ministerial buildings for the sector, which is why I'm struggling to understand what on earth he's doing all the way out here in the middle of the night. Naked, I added. Yes, indeed. We should cover the young lad to give him some decency until the coroner arrives. I wondered who we were protecting his decency from. The street outside was as empty as it always was. In the time it took for Sergeant Ashbridge to arrive after I called it in, I hadn't seen a single waking soul. Regardless, I pulled out some spare linen from the bottom of the wardrobe and handed it to the sergeant, who draped it over the body. As it fanned out in the air and floated down over Robbie Milton, the red and blue of the neon motel sign darted across its surface, rippling like small waves until it settled over the corpse, camouflaging it with the violet snow on the ground. Ashbridge stepped into the motel room afterwards and sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face in his hands. "Tell me, James, you don't mind me calling you James?" "Absolutely not, Sergeant," I replied, though I did wonder, being that he'd called me by my first name since our first meeting, how he would have acted if I had objected. "Tell me, James," he went on, "what's all this religious group like you mentioned? Surely you don't seriously think that the residents of I-42 are gallivanting around in the shadows, running some secret operation, do you? As I said, people are not so anonymous out here. They generally stick to the rules that the ministry lays down for them. You know as well as I the harsh penalties that would befall someone who might be involved in such a thing. People are not quick to take those sorts of risks when they're having a hard time. And I'll not pretend that I-42 is thriving. The less you have, the less you can afford to lose the things you do. I would hazard a guess that I know much more than you, Ashbridge, of the risks. Or perhaps he knew exactly what he was saying. I cast a quick glance at his face, though he was simply staring solemnly at the covered body outside the door, and I felt the twinge of suspicion pass away. In the short time I had spent with him so far, he had, after all, showed no sign of malice or territorial dominance towards me. I really don't know. The symbol I found on the boy's lip, Mark Briars' lip, it certainly looked to hold some level of significance, and what with the cross, I just assumed it was religious in nature. I was just simply putting two and two together in this case. Honestly, I haven't an awful lot more to move on right now. It's not that I doubt your line of thought, James. I just would have thought that if all this was on that kind of scale, then I would know all about it. I'm not blowing my own trumpet here. It's just the nature of the place, isn't it? Private lives can be very public in Moya, and that's especially true for the outer sectors. Oh, it's about bloody time, Palardi. I looked up to see the doctor's car pulling up slowly to the curbside out front of the motel room. It was an old model estate, the type made about 20 years prior, when Moya had just gained the ability to manufacture vehicles entirely independent from outside sources. The Model 3 Sonnet, they called it. Its black paintwork had given way to bubbled patches of red rust around the wheel arches, and the chrome trim now sat on the roadside, barely catching the light of the motel sign. The engine ticked over with a deep mechanical drumming, and when the doctor shut it off, the silence of the night drifted back over the car and settled around it with an air of relief. Dr. Palardi stepped out of the car and approached the motel room, yawning widely. Each of us all, gents. What have we got then? Each of us all, and good morning, Doctor. Young man apparently slammed into James's door right here in the middle of the night, and when he opened the door, you found him as he lays, which is right by your feet, damn it, man! The doctor's foot thudded into the side of the corpse of Robbie Milton, sending him headfirst towards the wall of the motel cabin. Somehow, with grace beyond his years and bleary-eyed state of half-sleep, he managed to stay upright with very little problem. Well, what have you got him covered up like that for, anyway? The young man is naked. What would you have me do? Well, he is dead, Ashbridge. I shouldn't have thought he's too embarrassed by it all. The doctor leant down and lifted the edge of the sheet and began lifting the lifeless arms to one side. At the same time, a light flickered on in the small, shed-like office of the motel. I'll pop over and see the owner, ask him a few questions if you don't need me here, Sergeant. Yes, good idea, James, he replied dismissively, entirely preoccupied, scrutinising the doctor and burning a hole into his back as he knelt beside the body on the ground. The small office was weathered and worn. Once painted a deep blue, it now stood slowly shedding its coloured skin, exposing the wood beneath. It had just one small window facing out towards the street and a thick metal door. In the centre was a scratched metal plate riveted onto the outside with the word "Reception" engraved in large capital letters. I twisted the beaten round metal knob in my hand, its cold surface biting at my palm, and heaved the heavy door open. Inside was dim and bare. Towards the back wall stood a small desk on a dark red carpet that had a pathway worn into it from the outside. Along the right side wall of the room was 3 plastic chairs in a row. A door hung in the opposite wall, leading off to what I assumed to be the owner's home. The door slammed loudly behind me as I let it go, and the silence of the room settled with the dust that had scattered from my entrance. I took a look out of the small window and could see the doctor and sergeant waving their arms at one another in the street by the body of Robbie Milton. Looking up the street in the opposite direction was a dim row of orange lights leading off into the darkness, eventually terminating with the curve of the long, flat road. About 50 yards past the motel, the road was lined on either side by the same single-storey box houses, familiar in most residential districts of Moya. Probably around 40 in total, but in all of them, not a single light. The entire street slept on, oblivious to the commotion going on outside my room. Each of us all, Agent Niven. You're up early. What can I do for you? The voice startled me and I jumped slightly as it broke through the muffled air of the small room. Oh, good morning, each of us all. I bring some bad news, I'm afraid. I explained the situation in rough terms to the shocked-looking motel owner. Alfred Cromes had mentioned that it was his grandson, but I might have guessed it even if he had not. The pair were uncannily alike, both in looks and mannerisms, except naturally the owner of the motel was significantly younger. I placed him in around his early 30s, though his hair was receding and he hadn't had the good grace to accept this fact and cut it shorter just yet. In the 3 days since my arrival, this was only the second time I had seen him, the first being upon my arrival at the motel after leaving Alfred's. He was the epitome of I-42. If he operated any slower, he would be going backwards. See anything? Nah, not me. I've been asleep all night. I've only just got up myself. I knew Robbie though. Well, I say I knew him. I knew of Robbie, perhaps I should say. Went to school with his older brother, but after we left, sort of drifted apart, what with them living up over the other side of the districts and that. I haven't seen him around this way since we were kids, honestly. Last I heard, he was working up that way too. Well, naturally with his parents being involved with the ministry, he would be, wouldn't he? Works up in the General Register office, I thought. Is there anything else you need me to do? You're the only guest we've got staying at the moment, so we don't have to worry about any of that at least. No, thank you. I just wanted to keep you informed, really. Thanks for the background. I looked out of the window and saw the doctor wrestling the body of Robbie Milton into the back of the estate car, closely tailed by Sergeant Ashbridge, who was throwing his arms wildly in the air, clearly in a state of despair. I'd best get back to this pair. Thanks again for your time, each of us all. I quickly opened the door and stepped back out into the biting air which stung at my face. I nestled my chin down into my coat, put my head down and walked towards the car, the voices of the duo now ringing in the morning sky. With the doctor and the sergeant finally gone, I slipped back into bed. After all the commotion of the morning, I was exhausted. Fortunately, it was still only 6 a.m, and so I could afford a few more hours before I needed to get up. Hell, it's not like time matters much out here anyway. The familiar ticking of the clock lulled me back into a comfortable drowsiness, despite standing around in the biting cold air for the past 2 hours. The snow cracked under my feet as I made my way up the path towards the mill. Just ahead I could see the two bodies lying out on the ground. The blood stained the snow beneath them, and they lay in the centre of the crimson fissure as it crept out, stretching to fill the entire pathway. As I got closer I could see the man, face down and on one side, his head already half covered by the drifting snow as the wind blew the red crystals to rest against the body. His ministry uniform, black and crisply ironed, was torn and ripped across the back. Strips of the material hung from the overhanging branches and wrapped around the fence, blown by the wind. It was damp with blood and the sheen of the sopping material shimmered in the daylight. The woman was wearing a pale beige dress, hitched up above her thighs. Her legs sprawled behind her, already turning blue under the tears in her thick tights. She lifted her head and soundlessly moved her lips. I took a few steps closer and asked her to repeat herself. I can't make out what you said. What was that? The girl spoke again in a limp whisper. No, I'm sorry, you need to speak up. The sound of the knocking snapped me from my sleep abruptly, and I instinctively checked the clock next to the bed. 10:30 a.m. I slipped out of bed quickly. Coming, hold on, just one moment. When I opened the door, I was greeted by Alfred, his brow furrowed at the sight of me.
I didn't wake you, did I, James? I do apologise. I forget not everyone is so keen to get out in the mornings as me.
Good morning, Alfred, each of us all. I had a bit of a difficult night. What can I do for you?
Yeah, I just heard from my grandson about all that. Terrible shame, but that's 2 ministry men now, isn't it? Awful strange.
It surprised me that until Alfred had said it, I had not made the connection that both the original victim and now the man from last night had both been ministry employees, and I made a mental note to myself that from now on I would not let the slow pace of this sector drag me down with it.
Anyway, sorry to wake you, James, only I got something I thought you might want to see.
In his hands was one of the faded copies of the Star newspaper that had been stacked throughout his house. He lifted it up to hand it over to me and then stopped, pulling it back slightly before thrusting it towards me. I took the paper and stared at the front page. Alfred, this paper is 20 years old. How long exactly do you keep newspapers for?
Yeah, all right. My grandson already gives me enough grief about that. Just take a look when you get time.
At what exactly, Alfred?
I thought you were the bloody investigator, James, and yet here I am doing all the work for you. Nah, take a look at the obituaries in there. I thought I had something the other night, but I wasn't sure until I dug this whole thing out. Been in the area a long enough time to have seen a few names come and go. Anyway, I'd best get off.
He looked up the street and I followed his gaze, but predictably it was empty as usual.
Each of us all, James.
Alfred bowed his head slightly and turned back to walk off up the road in the direction of his small concrete house. Each of us all, I called after him and then closed the door and tossed the paper onto the bed. He does have a funny way about him. Ashbridge certainly wasn't wrong about that. I slumped down after the paper and landed on the side of the bed heavily, rubbing my eyes and brushing my hair with my hand. The clock ticked on the wall. I flipped open the old yellow paper, which was brittle, and tore at the corner as soon as I grabbed the edge. I flattened it out on the bed, giving it some more space, and flicked towards the back and found the page containing the obituaries and scanned down it. Nothing stood out as I scanned the names and places. Just a list followed by short eulogies. Honestly, keeping an obituary column seemed to be somewhat absurd considering the time that this was written. About 3/4 of the way down the old page, however, I noticed the occupation of one of the dead. Sector I-42 Miller, Peter Briar, and then in brackets, 53, passed away unexpectedly and found on the pathway leading up to the mill on the morning of Saturday the 28th. Loving husband to Beth Briar for 33 years, he is survived by his son Lloyd, daughter-in-law Carla, and grandson Mark. Peter Briar? Surely not. Moya was created by Ben Cutmore. Intro and outro music is used under Creative Commons Attribution License and is called Russian Winter by Tim from tabletopaudio.com. You can help support the show by heading over to patreon.com/Moya podcast, and as thanks you gain access to a private Discord server, as well as early access to episodes and all that other good stuff. Thanks for listening.